Hello and welcome. My name is Nick Davies and I'm a Programme Director at the Institute for Government. Thank you very much for joining us for this event to mark the one-year anniversary of the unification of probation services in England. The new unified probation services combined the previously outsourced management of medium and low-risk offenders with the public sector National Probation Service, which managed high-risk offenders. Launched by the government on the 26th of June 2021, it was the fourth major restructuring of probation services in the last 2 decades. The transition was not expected to be easy. The 21 CRCs oversaw hundreds of thousands of cases, employed thousands of staff across hundreds of sites, and used different operating models. They were run by 6 companies, scores of subcontractors with different processes, terms and conditions, and working cultures. So how well has the transition worked? What more needs to be done to improve the running of probation services? And what lessons can be drawn from this experience for other major public service transformation programs? To discuss these issues and more, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 fantastic speakers. First up will be Jim Barton, the Executive Director for the Probation Reform Programme at the Ministry of Justice, who I believe is joining us from the MOJ's own event to mark the one-year anniversary. So thanks for making time for us today, Jim. He'll be followed by Suki Binning, the Chief Social Worker at CTEC, Executive Director at the Interventions Alliance and former CEO of the Kent, Surrey and Sussex Community Rehabilitation Company. And finally, we'll have Linda Neymantis, Head of Probation Inspection Programme at Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Probation. Following the opening remarks, I'll ask a few follow-up questions before opening it up to the audience. If you have a question for any of our panellists, then please raise your hand if you're attending in person, or if you're watching remotely, then please use the Q&A function that is available. And if you're watching remotely, you can submit those questions while we're speaking, and I'll try to get through as many of them as possible. I'd also encourage those watching remotely and in person to tweet using #IFGProbation. Right, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jim, our first panellist, for some opening remarks.
Thanks, and apologies for not being in the room with those of you in London today. I think your room looks slightly more glamorous than the dowdy room I managed to commandeer at a hotel in Sheffield. So to give you my reflections on probation reform, they basically split in 2. The first is to celebrate what we managed to achieve in terms of successfully unifying the probation service last June in the context of COVID. And so often government is rightly challenged and criticised for its failure to deliver major programmes to plan. This is not one of those programmes. So there were many commentators, many individuals who doubted our ability to successfully bring the CRC contracts to an end, to transfer over 7,000 staff from, as you say, more than 50 legacy employers when you include subcontractors, to make sure those staff had a role, had working IT, were sufficiently clear on our processes to be able to operate safely and effectively on day one, and were paid at the end of the month. And of course, there are exceptions to that, but at a headline level, we achieved that. And that's been validated by Infrastructure and Projects Authority, Government Internal Audit, and others who've looked back at the progress the programme managed to achieve in that immediate structural unification. But the second part of my reflection would be to acknowledge that there are still really significant challenges that face the probation service. And the simple fact of structural unification didn't and couldn't fix those challenges. It brought together the existing cohort of staff. It could not magic out of thin air the several thousand additional staff that we know we need to recruit into the probation service, and indeed are recruiting, in order to be able to be fully staffed to achieve our target operating model and to reduce workload for frontline staff. Nor could it overnight address the legacy challenges that we have both in our estate, our physical estates, and in the IT tools available to our staff on a day-to-day basis. Probation reform has helped on both. And there are now, I believe, over 50 properties across England and Wales that have been head-to-toe modernised, updated, to provide a more modern and appropriate workplace for our staff and people on probation. There are many more properties where we know we have work to do to address the legacy of investment challenges around a property. And similarly on our IT, we all know that the tools available to our staff need updating, need improving. Probation reform has taken us a considerable way down that road, but there is much still to do. Probation reform as a programme is due to close at the end of this calendar year. That still feels right. I think at some point it's right to remove the kind of machinery of a major programme and instead hand the task of the work still to do over to the operational line, over to our regional probation directors. But I'm in no doubt, under no illusions around the scale of the challenge that lies ahead over the course of the next few years. I would say, and it will be great to hear from Suki and Linda and get into the debate, that probation reform has moved us forward significantly compared to the position we were in prior to the reforms.
Jim, thank you very much. That's great. Suki, I'm going to come to you next.
Following the announcement of the unification of probation, our priority was really to ensure the safe transfer of services. And during that initial period, we raised some concerns, not at least attempting to restructure during a pandemic. One of the other issues that we raised was regarding services that the CRCs provided falling through the gaps. So services that the CRCs had commissioned because we couldn't see a route for them in the new target operating model. Also, more work needed to be done on what was originally the dynamic framework, now is the CRS, in terms of better understanding those commissioning needs. What we found very quickly after those commissions was that some of those services have been oversubscribed, so we're seeing double the number of individuals being referred. So that was one of the other issues that we had raised. I've spent the majority of my 27 years in probation trusts and in the CRC, always following an approach which looked at resource following risk. And what I'm talking about risk is the risk of harm, not the likelihood of reoffending. So the first time in my career as a senior leader, we had the opportunity to really focus on and understand the needs of low to medium risk individuals. And if we are to really reduce reoffending, we need to continue to build that evidence base and those interventions for those individuals. And another issue that we had kind of raised was the kind of how quickly the change had happened, 2 major restructures in a period of 6 to 7 years. Those kinds of restructures should never be rushed. And also to have more opportunity for a wider and more open debate about models of delivery. We would have liked to have seen that debate happen and certainly explore other options when you have that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make significant changes. So, for example, we did share a model that we thought may address some of the issues around having possibly, for example, a system where one agency looks after those sentenced to custody and another agency that looks after those that are sentenced to a community order. Both agencies could be public sector run agencies, but the community one more aligned with PCCs, local authorities or devolved areas. So for me, it's really about if we're having major restructures to open up the debate a bit more. But finally, what I would like to say, and it is to echo what Jim has said, full credit to everybody in HMPPS, the CRCs and the MPS for the safe and smooth transition of staff, service users and all the assets. It's not an easy feat, so absolute credit there. I think the service now needs to go through a period of looking at really understanding, the needs of the people that we work with and adopting new approaches to work with those individuals effectively.
Thank you. And to our final speaker, Linda.
Lovely. Thanks, Nick. So yeah, just to reflect on what our Chief Inspector said at the time of unification, he was very clear that unification by itself wouldn't be a magic bullet. So that's very similar to the point that Jim has made. So merely transferring thousands of staff and tens of thousands of cases wouldn't deal with some of the underlying and quite fundamental issues that our inspections have uncovered over the last few years. So some of those issues that we've have found over the last few years have been around that critical lack of frontline staff, excessive caseloads, as well as overloaded middle manager grades, and as Jim has said, some poor quality legacy accommodation from the MPS. And nor, our Chief Inspector Justin Russell has said, and nor would unification solve the issue of the lack of investment over the past decade in the broader ecosystem for probation, so mental health, drug treatment and multi-agency partnerships on which we know probation relies so much. But I think both Suki and Jim's point, in practice, there were no major disruptions to service provision over the transition period as cases and staff were transferred over. So I think, credit absolutely due there. But however, as Jim has said and the wider probation service has said, that actually unification, last June was merely the beginning of the journey, and genuine transformation is a much, much longer road which requires sustained additional investment and leadership as well as culture change. So we commenced our new inspection programme in autumn of last year, which is now conducted at PDU level, and we've undertaken 6 PDU inspections across England and Wales, with the results seeing 4 PDUs rated as inadequate and 2 as requires improvement. So as has been highlighted, genuine transformation is a much longer road, but I think one of the questions is, at what point should we start to expect to see better inspection outcomes? So just as part of our inspection outcomes, some of the key things that have been highlighted, and I think these have been touched on a bit already, is just in relation to staffing, and staffing feel that they are overworked and have caseloads which are unmanageable, about staff vacancies and staff leaving as well. And also, I think that one of the things that's come out of our inspections is the impact of new staff starting in the service. Fantastic that lots of new staff are starting in the service, but I think it's been a challenge for staff to get the appropriate learning and development opportunities. So I guess all of this has taken place, in the context of COVID, which we can't talk about unification without talking about COVID. So that we know, so from our inspection findings, we can see that obviously there's been a lot more online learning and staff not being in the office to learn from more experienced colleagues. And what we found as well from our inspections is that where there are staff shortages in the PDUs, that staff need to be really clear about what to prioritise. One of the other findings from our PDU inspections is in relation to services. So we've found that there needs to be more of a focus on the implementation and delivery of services to improve desistance. So clearly service delivery is being impacted by COVID. That feels to be, or not feels, we've found a lot of check-in appointments are happening, obviously lack of availability of accredited programmes and ability to deliver RARs, and of course there's the ongoing challenges of the unpaid work backlog. And also, and I think to one of Suki's points, that we've also seen in some areas there's not been enough of the CRS provision. And finally, as well, one of the things that we found in our inspections is around the quality of practice, and we found that risk of harm practice in particular has been insufficient against our standards in 60% of cases. So those are our findings from the 6 PDU inspections that we have done to date. But clearly, there are lots of opportunities to come. But as I say, we can't talk about unification without talking about the impacts of the pandemic as well.
Thank you. And I really want to talk about kind of COVID and the very tight timeline for delivering this. But beforehand, I'd just like to focus firstly on the fact that the initial transition did go well without disruption. And Jim, you quite rightly said that lots of organisations had raised concerns about the department's ability to do that, given disruptions. We were one of those organisations, and lots of others that we've spoken to as part of some research that we are doing have said that despite that tight time frame, it was delivered on time and well. And so I'd just like to kind of dig into how that has happened. Jim, as you said, the government doesn't have a great track record on these types of things. I wonder, from your perspective, what were the kind of the key success factors that led to the lack of disruption in that day one transfer?
Sure. So to start with a caveat, if that's okay, I mean, I would absolutely acknowledge it was not perfect. And if you remember a staff whose pay wasn't correct at the end of the first month, that is a problem. And please don't anybody think we're kind of hiding behind a kind of impression that it was perfect. It wasn't. I agree with the premise of the question, though. Overall, I think it went well. I mean, I'd point to two things. So the first goes to a comment Suki made, which is it's testament to the professional commitment and vocational drive of all of our staff and leaders. And, Suki, I'll name check you in that process. So for those leaders who'd given their heart and soul to making CRCs work, they were able to set that to one side and make this transition work and focus on getting it right for their staff and the people on probation that they serve. So I think some of this has come down to the vocational commitment of everybody across the probation service, and it's no accident that we've survived 2, 3, 4 major structural changes over the course of the last 10 years. And the second, though, I think is something which is a little bit more kind of change management-y, which is we had the archetype of what people call a burning platform. So that sense that you have to achieve something by a given date. And not having the option to contractually extend CRC contracts beyond midnight on the 25th of June last year meant there was no option but to be ready. And I think that focused everybody's minds and efforts. And it also required us to be quite robust in determining what changes we would try to achieve for day one of the new model, as opposed to defer and pick up through the second phase of the reform programme. And probably worth acknowledging, this is a change that the vast majority of staff were behind, except there are exceptions to that. And it also had broad support from our trade unions. That helps.
Thank you. And so I want to come back to that burning platform question in a second, because I think for some the platform probably wasn't as light as it was for others. But I just want to ask, from your perspective, one of the questions that there often is about when you're insourcing major services is the kind of the relationship between government and the supplier, when the supplier knows that there isn't going to be a contract going forward. How well did you feel that the process went, and how did you feel the kind of relationship was maintained through that process?
I think there were two parts in terms of how it went and the relationship. I think the initial kind of notification and announcement, I don't think that was done as well as it could have been done in terms of the relationship with the CRC chief execs, for example. I have openly, through that period, said that I was the custodian of the CRC, regardless of who the owners were, public sector, private sector, a new kind of parent company coming in, and not to have been kind of been engaged in that process and just kind of an announcement made and no opportunity to kind of have those discussions wasn't as, I would have wanted it to be. However, once we'd kind of moved past, and as Jim said, we had a clear date, and that was the date, and we weren't able to move on that note, then everybody's kind of, yes, we need to do this, and our priority was that kind of transfer. We did have a challenge in terms of explaining to our colleagues, so, 1,200 people across Wales, the South West and Kent, Surrey and Sussex, as to why we were doing that in the pandemic. People were working extremely hard to keep the show on the road in terms of seeing our service users through the pandemic, and it was really difficult to kind of explain why this was happening. But once we had those clear milestones and really good relationship with Jim's kind of programme team and spots to kind of liaise with, things became kind of much smoother.
And let's move on to that question of COVID. And clearly this would have been a major transformation at any time.
Yeah.
Everything was made more difficult by COVID. Is there anything that would have gone better if it had been delayed, or any benefits that might have come from delaying the process or staggering it, or in some other way taking account for the fact that there'd been this hopefully once in a lifetime disruption to all of our lives?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I actually know I don't think I really know the answer to that. But I think why I wanted to highlight it is that COVID brought so many problems, particularly for the CRCs, around the unpaid work delivery, the accredited programme delivery, being able to deliver RARs, all of which are really big jigsaw pieces for probation. And I think, a lot of those issues still remain. So whether, even if there hadn't have been unification, I'm sure that we would still be struggling with the probation would still be struggling with those areas.
Jim, I was going to come to you next, because I know that you were kind of, when kind of we spoke, and when you kind of spoke publicly in kind of early 2021 about this process in the run up to the transition, you were always very, very clear that there was no going back, there was no alternative. But you knew it was going to be a challenge. I mean, can you just kind of talk through your thinking of why it was such a hard line on the timing?
Yeah, of course. So the decision by ministers at the time was, I suppose, informed by two things. So firstly, and I'm expecting this to be played back at me in a second, but not wanting to expose ourselves to a further period of CRCs, because they were underfunded, struggling to deliver services to a standard that we could tolerate. And there were exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is represented on your panel, but there was a very clear view, which I think was justified at the time, remains justified, that if we were going to do this thing, we should do it as quickly as possible to be able to break that cycle and not be bound by the limitations of the CRC contracts. And the second, which informed the decision to pull the delivery partner competition, so that prior to COVID, our intent was to contract out unpaid work and accredited programmes. We pulled that in the early days of COVID, and that's the process that Suki's referring to. That was driven by a clear view that we wanted control. So in the context of COVID, we didn't want to be exposed to a kind of ongoing dependence on, first of all, being able to see a competitive process through, hoping that those providers would survive COVID. None of us, I think, had a sense of what its impact would be, but also being able to kind of just bring all of this together into a single entity, single programme. I think that decision remains absolutely the right one. I'd acknowledge Suki's point around it was a decision that was made, pretty much behind closed doors. To the thrust of your original question, so I have to acknowledge that, we had to cut the scope of the commissioned rehabilitative services that we were trying to put in place for this time last year. We're only just now correcting that. So we've run competitions to provide finance, benefit and debt support, dependency and recovery support. So, that's a literal thing that if we had had more time to do, would have been in place early. I don't think that deficit outweighs the benefit of getting on and delivering it to that target date.
And so I'm going to come in with some questions for the audience in a moment, and so do keep submitting them online and do think in person. Just before I do, see one final question to you. As Jim just said, the CRCs that you were overseeing were performing better. From your perspective, what else? What were there alternatives? Would you have liked to continue for a bit longer? Were there certain parts of your delivery model that you thought could have been retained with more time?
Absolutely. Just the year prior to COVID, Kent, Surrey and Sussex, so the CTEC run CRC we stepped into the southwest and Wales, where the provider there went into administration. And the work that we did in that 1 year, I think was pretty impressive, and that was recognised by HMIP. We moved from requires inadequate to requires improvement, address the issue of kind of staffing gaps that were there in Wales and the South West. So we absolutely would have wanted to kind of see that progress from kind of requires improvement to good, because we were certainly on track. So yes, the short answer is we would have wanted to see that through.
Great. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience here in person. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'm going to go to this gentleman here and then this gentleman over here.
Yeah, well, my name's...
if you could use the mic, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sorry about that, it's karaoke. So my name is Mike Guilfoyle. I'm a former probation officer, a member of the Probation Union NAPO, and also a magistrate, and a member of the Magistrates Association, but I'm not here. I'm here in a personal capacity. And thank you to all our speakers for giving some wonderful contextual background to the reunification process. One aspect of the practical outworking of sentencing, as a sentencer, I've been sitting in South East London for 8 years in the adult court, is the RAR. The RAR was mentioned earlier. It was subject to, the rehabilitation activity requirement. It was subject to a critical report by Glenys Stacey 2 or 3 years ago, who was then the Chief Inspector of Probation. But I have to say, it's one of the most bewilderingly vague sentencing options that magistrates have and sentencers have. The metric is unclear. And I'm just thinking, is it about time to re-establish or bring back a supervisory requirement as a bedrock to more effective engagement with service users and those who appear before the courts, rather than what seems to be a rather loose fig leaf for some of the shortcomings in the delivery models that you've been talking about? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take 2 questions together, so we'll take the other question as well.
Hi, my name is Phil Wheatley. I was Director General of NOMS a long time ago. I'm just interested in where we are with the resources, because Jim said we were struggling to deliver in the CRCs because some of them we didn't think were resourced properly. There were no doubt other issues, but that certainly was one the Probation Inspectorate had been giving some evidence for. You haven't, as far as I know, got a slug of new money, and it's probably unlikely you're going to get a lot of new money in the current environment. Where are we on thinking we're fully funded to do all the things you're trying to do, and how much will the problems you have to grapple with relate to not being as funded as you would ideally like to be?
Thank you. 2 quite detailed and thoughtful questions. Jim, I think I'm going to come to you on those first. So on the question of funding, given the ambitions for the service, and on the rehabilitation activity requirement and bringing back the supervisory requirement.
So take them in reverse order, and hello, Phil. It would be lovely to see you. I can't see you, but nice to hear your voice again. So on funding, actually good news. So through the spending review process, we've managed to secure an increase in the probation budget of 15%. That's an extra 155 million a year. That will allow us over time to increase the number of probation staff, so not probation officers, but the total size of the organisation from its current position, which is about 17,500, to above 20,000. That will take us several years due to recruiting, training staff, but by 25, 26, we'll be an organisation that will be significantly bigger. That 155 million of investment has then been topped up with 93 million over the 3-year period for unpaid work, as well as additional investment in reducing reoffending and electronic monitoring. So for once, certainly the first time I can remember, we can't use the "we don't have enough money" excuse to not tackle and turn around the issues that we have in probation at the moment. Obviously, we want to hold on to that money. We'll be doing our very best to do that. On the first question around RAR and supervision, so I think it's a legitimate debate, and we can absolutely, I think, trace some of the challenges we've got in the system back to, that combination of factors that happened in 15-16 with outsourcing, changing the legislative framework, and then extending supervision to the under 12-month group. And I think those changes all coming together and make it quite difficult to unravel what was the root cause of the problems we then experienced. I think our current view is that, of course, we could go back to kind of change the legislation and reflect on it, but this is more about practice and the expectations that we set of ourselves and of staff. And I think Linda made reference earlier to that kind of drift during COVID. Maybe drift isn't the right word. The move during COVID to more remote contact, more of a kind of check-in culture. And that is the thing that we need to address, I think. And I think we can do that within existing legislation. I'm not dismissing the question, though. I think it is very much a legitimate debate. But our current position is we don't need to invest time and effort in legislative change. We should be focused on practice.
Thank you. Suki?
Just to kind of make a point around the kind of additional funding, which is absolutely great news. One of the things I'd be really keen to look at, that investment going into the continuous professional development of our colleagues in the probation service. I think for a number of years in probation, we haven't kept up to date as other similar professions. So, you know, I'm a social worker, the CPD kind of arrangements for social workers are much more kind of advanced than where we are with probation colleagues. So that investment into kind of training our colleagues will be really good, but also in terms of the role of probation officers and probation service officers in terms of accessing services, also kind of playing the role of looking at other services that are available. We've had a culture previously in probation, and I'm hoping it's one that's going to be addressed, where probation staff don't tend to refer to services. Even in the probation trust, we had a history of we would procure services, then they wouldn't get referred to. So putting more effort into kind of training would be really good. And also into kind of research around evidence-based for different cohorts of individuals. You know, we're very lucky, I think, in England and Wales, we have an inspectorate that, as well as inspecting, have a really strong research kind of function as well, and the work that's kind of been done there in partnership with academics and other research bodies is really useful, and to look at some more investment into that kind of evidence base for probation.
Thank you. And Jim, I just wanted to pick up with you a bit on the workforce question. Clearly there's been a lot in the news at the moment about public sector workforce pay and conditions, etc. And I wondered to what extent you feel confident that even with that extra money, given the kind of demands of inflation that might come from staff, but also I suppose the competition for those staff from other parts of the public sector, particularly, for example, the police that are also looking to recruit a lot of staff at the moment on, you know, relatively good terms and conditions, etc. Whether you feel that money is going to be confident or sufficient to fill the acknowledged workforce gaps that you have.
Yeah, I mean, there's no getting around the fact that the workforce market is incredibly complex and challenged at the moment, and we're not immune from that. Point to a couple of kind of things that give me confidence going into the next couple of years. So the first is we have continue to be successful in recruiting. So we brought 2,500 trainee probation officers in the last 2 years, the highest on record as far as I'm aware. We're currently recruiting at scale for unpaid work supervisors, 500 new jobs across the country, funded by that £93 million of those roles. We've been really successful in all bar 2 of our 12 regions. So the kind of the current response to our offer, if you like, in the market has continued to be positive, but we're in no way kind of resting on laurels or thinking that there are not going to be headwinds over the course of the next couple of years. I think it's impossible to pick up a paper at the moment and not feel that the next couple of years are going to be challenging.
Linda?
Yeah, no, just briefly, and I think I said it in my opening remarks, and just to kind of reinforce what Suki's just said about that continuous professional development and the importance of it. And actually, you know, it's fantastic that all of these new staff are joining the service, but I think what we are then finding is you have got then an inexperienced workforce. So with that, there are opportunities, but there are challenges. There are real challenges with that as well, and it's around how can the service ensure that staff are also staying, so that those experienced staff stay within the service.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in some questions that we've had online. So I'm going to start with the question we've had from Nicola Carr, which is directed to Jim. If probation reform programme ends this year, who will drive the next phase of the reforms? And if it is regional directors, how will they be empowered to do so?
Thanks, Nicola. So on the first part of that question, the leadership team in probation stays pretty much the same post-probation reform ending. Amy Rees will be there as our Director General, Sonia Flynn as Chief Probation Officer. So the kind of, the driving force, if you like, behind probation reform isn't changed by us closing the programme as an entity. On the second part of what I'm going to do is a different question, but that's not to worry you with. On the second part of that question around RPDs and empowerment, so absolutely with a caveat. And I think that there is still a kind of sense that we're finding our balancing point as an organisation that is national. It used to say it in the name, it doesn't anymore, but it's a national service across England and Wales, but that can only deliver at a local level. And I think my reflection would be when we formed the National Probation Service, so the precursor in 2014-15, that pendulum swung hard to national uniformity and a top-down approach to leadership. I think we've had to channel a version of that through the first phase of probation reform, where we had to get something delivered everywhere by a certain date. That drives you towards more of a centralist approach. I think everybody in that leadership team now agrees the pendulum has to swing back. I think there are differences of opinion and perspective about where its kind of settling point is, though. But absolutely would see the story of the next couple of years being increased, I was going to say independence, that's not the word I mean, increased control and flexibility in the hands of regional probation directors.
And Linda, just to come to you on that, what kind of assessment has the inspectorate made of the capability or the capacity of regional directors to deliver that, and on any thoughts on the timing of ending the reform programme?
Yeah, no, thanks again. Good question. I guess what we've seen in our inspections to date is that, there is some tension that we are seeing between what's happening at a national level and a regional level and at a PDU level, and how much, how much flexibility does a head of a PDU have, for example, to be able to deliver, because some of the things they may want to do may not be within their gift. So I think what we are finding at the moment is that I guess those relationships between national, the region, and a PDU level are still, I think they're still being worked out, and I think that's what we're finding at the moment. Obviously, for us as an inspectorate, what we are interested in is what is being delivered on the ground, and not necessarily for us to go, it should be this model or that model. It's about how effectively our service is being delivered on the ground. But it still feels as if there is a way to go to work out those relationships.
Thank you. I'll come to more questions in the audience. We've got three. I'll take all three together. We'll go there, and then here.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. It's Rory Lane here from KPMG. So, Jim, you mentioned at the start some of the programme of reform that is still to take place, and you mentioned the digital programme. And I'm interested to understand the thoughts of the panel in terms of how transformative those digital reforms can be to increase efficiency but also effectiveness within the probation service.
Great, and then in here.
Yeah, my name's Fred Punsonby. I'm a magistrate. I'm also on the Labour front bench in the House of Lords. And I wanted to ask about the Labour Party's proposal regarding community sentences, which would be more administered on a community level, if I can put it like that. So I see that as similar to the youth referral panel type arrangement. And Suki, I was interested in your comment that there were the scope for increasing multi-agency working. This could be an example of an increased type of multi-agency working with the probation service. I mean, to what extent do you think that can be increased? And I draw on my own experience sitting in the domestic abuse court in Westminster, where we have an input from the local authorities and the social services to us when we sentence and make bail decisions. So to me, that's quite a good example of an increased multi-agency working. I mean, what's your view on the scope of increasing that, considerably further?
Great. And then finally, we'll take this third question and then go to answers.
Thanks very much. Thank you. My name's Rob Allen. I'm an independent researcher and consultant these days. It's about prisons and the function of helping people when they're leaving prisons. I've read a few inspection reports over the last year or so which suggests that bit of work might have suffered, stuff that CRCs were doing and are no longer doing, and the Unified Service and its subcontractors aren't necessarily providing that in the same way or to the same level. I just wondered whether you would see that is perhaps one particular service area where there has been a diminution of the quality of work.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to come to you first, Jim, particularly on the kind of the digital reform question, but then your thoughts also on community sentences for support for those leaving prisoners as well.
Yep, thanks, Nick. So, I mean, I think the simple answer to Rory's question is the potential to be transformative is massive. And to give credit to CTEC and also MTC Novo, they demonstrated what you could achieve through better digital tools. To put this in context, we estimate that about 1,600 years of probation practitioner effort goes into filling in Oasis every year. That's a massive amount of time spent on a system. Now, of course, some of that is good productive time because it's part of the process of assessing risk and need information, but the potential to reduce that and therefore for that time to be invested in other activity with people on probation is massive. I think we're in the foothills of that process, but our ambition is pretty significant. On the second question around the potential for community supervision to be done at more local level, so I think at its best it already is to an extent. I think there are great examples of partnership working with PCCs, with local police forces, with local football clubs, where community payback is really embedded in what those local stakeholders and communities want to see as the recompense for when offenders commit crime, commit harm in neighbourhoods. I would absolutely accept that's not the totality of unpaid work or community payback today, but that direction of travel towards giving greater voice for communities is one that I think we are already on. And then finally on the point around prisons, so yes, the move away from what was enhanced through the gate to our new resettlement model has introduced two things that we are still working through. So the first is those gaps in community rehab service provision that we talked about earlier. To give an example, we're in dialogue with providers at the moment about potentially extending the support, extending accommodation support to unsentenced prisoners. That is something that I think makes sense to all of us, but we're still to do. And then the second is in some establishments, the staffing of those pre-release teams is challenged by wider staffing challenges within the regions. So there are definitely establishments where we know, and HMI Prisons is telling us as our IMBs, that the current resettlement service is not at the level we want it to be. And that's firmly on our radar to address.
So I'm going to come to you next. Just quickly on the digital question, I know the case management system that you had was one of the things the reforms you were most proud of and worried that was being lost. Can you just provide a little bit of detail of what it did and why it was better before, and therefore in answering the question of what's possible, and then welcome particularly your thought on community sentences and collaboration between local agencies.
The tool that we had was actually designed by practitioners It also ensured that there wasn't a lot of duplication, because the previous system that we had worked in the probation trusts, you know, you were putting the same information in time and time again, and it was taking a long time to kind of do those assessments as well. And the tool didn't have much flexibility. So if your approach kind of changed and you had new interventions, you would have to wait a long time to update it. Whereas one of the kind of benefits we had was the kind of agility to change things really, really quickly. And it was a tool because it was designed by kind of practitioners, and changes could be made really quickly. That made kind of things much more easier and saved time, so colleagues could spend more face-to-face time with those on supervision rather than sitting behind a screen and filling in a form.
Great. And then particularly any thoughts you have on the second question about kind of community sentences and the scope for more multi-agency working locally?
I think absolutely, and I know that the regional probation directors that I still work with, you know, I have strong relationships with the PCCs and are starting to kind of look at kind of co-commissioning, so that's really, really welcome. So I think there is a real opportunity there around some of those community sentence provisions. I also think, you referred to youth offending teams. I think probation can learn a lot from the approach from youth offending teams, particularly around that multi-agency approach.
And then, Linda, particularly from you on the third question about the kind of the quality of support for those leaving prison and the kind of the extent of the disruption that this transition has caused to that.
Yeah, indeed. So certainly from the PDU inspections that we've done to date, we've found that the pre-release work has been quite poor. Has been quite poor overall. So has been disruptive. Obviously, with the end of the through the gate, with the end of the CRCs and through the gate, we are just in the process of doing an OMIC inspection as well, offender management in custody, and that will come out. That will come out shortly. So I'm sure there will be some interesting findings in that. But clearly, the pre-release work, as you said, has been impacted.
Great. I'm just going to take a couple of questions that we've had online. Both of which refer to the voluntary sector. So Rob McMillan from Sheffield Hallam University has asked, do speakers think the balance is right in terms of involvement of voluntary organisations in delivery? Repeated experience in competitions is that larger organisations can succeed, while smaller community-based and specialists lose out. And then also a question from Kate Paradine, the CEO of Women in Prison, who said, a question mainly for Jim, what lessons can be learned for government about commissioning services and involving a mixed economy of providers, including from the small and medium-sized charities? So Jim, not to break a habit of lifetime, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Yeah, so to answer the two together, if that's okay. So I'm going to get myself into a definitional debate here, but by the strict letter of voluntary community sector BCS, 2/3 of the CRS contracts that we let were to voluntary sector organisations, except that the majority of those are towards the larger end of what constitutes a BCS organisation. But just on the strict letter of this, the majority did go to the third sector. That said, we absolutely recognise the kind of thrust of the point that's been made through both questions, that our commercial processes do lend themselves to organisations that can put resource and effort behind them and, you know, have on the shelf already various certificates and evidence that they meet the standards that we set. Our response to that is to try to move to a position where we make much greater use of grants, and we're exploring moving to a position where any arrangement that we enter into that's under £1 million whole life value would be a grant rather than via full procurement. Now, that isn't a panacea, it's not a magic bullet. Grants have their own bureaucracy around them, but we're doing that principally to try and address the point that both Rob and Kate are making, that it can be experienced as onerous and off-putting when you kind of are faced with the full fat version of our procurement processes. And that's something we've consulted on recently via Clinks.
So can I just come to you on that? Because obviously CTEC were a prime contractor and had quite a lot of subcontractors from the voluntary and community sector as part of the delivery. I mean, how well did you find that relationship worked? And were there, for example, any of your subcontractors that you knew were unable to win contracts through the new model that you think we're missing some important expertise there?
Absolutely, we did have our subcontractors say to us that, once they'd looked at the target operating model and, the dynamic framework, they weren't in a position to go forward. But I think the point that Jim makes around kind of grants is a really good point, because that is a route into ensuring that we don't lose the expertise of those organisations. Our experience was, you can't deliver probation services on your own. There are small organisations out there that have big impact, and it's really important to keep those organisations on board. And I think one of the areas that we have seen particularly impacted is around services for women, in terms of what was spent previously and what's spent now on women's services. So again, for me, over the next couple of years, I'd be really keen to kind of look at that. And we, as a private organisation, an employee-owned organisation, also had to make the decision in some cases not to bid for some of the work that we were already delivering, because we couldn't make it work. And in some areas, we took the decision that we weren't going to kind of bid in an area because we had a voluntary sector, third sector subcontractor that was going to kind of bid in that area as well.
I'm going to ask you this question. I think you've largely already answered it. So someone's said, is outsourcing really the right delivery option, given that such services are all dependent on referrals in to start the transaction, yet such referrals have to start with a responsible officer who, Suki has already said, often don't refer? Would it be better to keep it all in-house?
Even in-house, the point I was making was, even when I worked in the probation trust, there is a cultural issue around referring. So you can have an in-house accredited programme team, and that issue still is there. So I think one of the challenges is around addressing that, and that's why I think the point around kind of training of colleagues and the continuous professional development is where we need to focus to change that culture.
Great. I'm going to come to see if there are any final questions in the room. If not, I'm going to ask one other question that we've received online, which was what improvement will happen around GDPR and data requests with other agencies? So this person said that CRCs and then Unification were given as excuses locally for substandard sharing requests. Are there any standardisations and local level agreements coming? Jim, I think that's for you.
Yeah, so a couple of different threads to that, perhaps. So information sharing between probation and other criminal justice partners and vice versa, I think has long been an area in which improvements are possible. We've recently refreshed our guidance for staff in court around the need to not only seek information but to receive that information back before we should be recommending an electronic monitoring curfew, for example. And that can lead to some frustration, because sometimes that information it takes time to secure it from local authorities or from police. I'm sure those organisations experience similar from us. Part of this is about information sharing protocols. That's something we're always looking to sharpen up. The real fix here is systematising more of that data share wherever possible, and breaking down some of those barriers to us each accessing each other's system where we've got legitimate operational need for that information. So yeah, an area in which I think we've long-standing had challenges, an area in which we're making slow but steady progress.
And I just wanted to pick up on something we discussed earlier in terms of the disruption caused by COVID. Clearly, there's been, again, a lot of discussion in the news recently about the effectiveness of civil servants when working from home versus working in the office. Jim, am I right in thinking that your team was largely remote throughout this whole transition, and I therefore wondered if you had any reflections on what can be done remotely versus what needs to be done in person.
Yeah, just to reassure you, this is not my spare bedroom. I am out at a work event today. So, I mean, I think it's genuinely amazing what we've all collectively managed to achieve through COVID, both in terms of keeping the operational service running, but also demonstrating how we can adapt our kind of working practices. So to give you an example from reform, we turned on ahead our approach to dishing out new IT kit, and it was all dispatched to home by secure couriers. We wouldn't previously, I think, have stomached that. We demonstrated that was possible. And my own reflection, thinking about my team, is that for those who were part of the team pre-COVID, I think it was a challenge and a headache, but something we could get our heads around. I think for colleagues who've joined the team during COVID, it's been far more challenging because they just don't have those networks and connections that they can rely on. And I think we see a version of that now in Linda's comments and HMIP's observations on the way practices developed in regions in PDUs, that some of the bonds between teams have become just a little bit stretched or frayed due to not having as much time together. And I think that will kind of see us just incrementally, I think, try to keep shifting the dial back to more face-to-face working wherever that is possible.
Linda?
Yeah, no, just to comment really, and I think to Suki's point about the importance of evidence, I don't think there is enough evidence about remote delivery of probation and probation work, and I understand there is going to be research done around that, so we would welcome that. But fundamentally, the work with people on probation, a big part of it is about relationships, which is done face to face. So we really welcome what we're hearing about the drive for practitioners to be in offices and work with people on probation.
And I'm just going to ask one final question, first to Suki and then to Jim. Suki, is there anything you haven't discussed that you wish had been done differently in this process, or that if you were advising a future government that were considering a kind of a transformation of similar scale, would be your kind of key bit of advice to them when considering something like this?
To go forward in a collaborative manner and speak to other kind of like providers, partners and stakeholders. There's a wealth of kind of experience and knowledge out there, and to engage those.
And Jim, is there anything you would do differently?
So I would, this is not exciting, but I'm going to agree with Suki. I think it feels uncomfortable with hindsight that the decision in 2020 to stop the delivery partner competition was a decision that we made and then communicated to CRCs rather than engaging them fully in that process. If I had my time again, I might look to approach that differently. I think there was a rationale for that approach. I echo Suki's reflections that it doesn't necessarily feel consistent with the way that we've always tried to work together in partnership, which is very much the probation way.
Thank you. Well, with that, I'm going to bring the discussion to a close. Thank you to our three speakers for a really fascinating discussion, for all those who submitted really thoughtful questions, and for those who are listening back later on SoundCloud, YouTube, or on a podcast platform. For those who want to know more about this topic, the Institute will be publishing a report relatively shortly, looking at this process, what went well, what went less well, and what can be learned for the future. So keep in touch, and until then, thank you very much. Goodbye.